Welcome to the DX Today podcast, where you get facts and no hype. I'm Derek.
And I'm Chloe. Today, we are moving past the headlines and the social media demonstrations to look at the industrial reality of a company that has, quite literally, been inside our heads lately. We're talking about Neuralink.
For years, Neuralink was a laboratory project, a series of high-profile show-and-tell events involving rodents and pigs. But the data we're looking at today suggests a massive pivot. Neuralink is moving out of the R&D phase and into what they're calling their manufacturing era.
It's a huge shift, Derek. We're talking about going from one-off surgical prototypes to a target of mass-producing brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, by 2026. To do that, they've broken ground on a massive 112,000 square foot facility in Del Valle, Texas.
Right. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of that factory, let's ground this in some history. Neuralink started in 2016, but it wasn't a smooth ride to human trials. In fact, back in 2022, the FDA actually rejected their initial application.
I remember that. There were big concerns about the battery safety and, interestingly, thread migration, the idea that those tiny electrode threads might move around inside the brain after they're implanted.
Exactly. It took until May 2023 to get the green light for the PRIME study. And then, in January 2024, we saw the first human patient, Noland Arbaugh. Now, the no-hype version of that story is that it was a roller coaster. Chloe, you saw the reports on the thread retraction.
Yeah, it was significant. About 85% of the threads inserted in Noland's brain actually retracted. Now, in a traditional medical trial, that might have been a total failure. But Neuralink used software optimizations to compensate for the lost signal. They basically recalibrated the remaining threads to be more sensitive.
And they learned from it. By the time the second patient, Alex, received his implant in August 2024, they changed the surgical technique, inserting the threads deeper into the motor cortex. So far, that seems to have solved the retraction issue.
It's that move fast and break things mentality, but applied to neurosurgery, which brings us to the scale. Derek, 100,000 square feet in Texas, that's not a lab, that's a factory.
It's located just 10 miles from Tesla's Gigafactory. This is the Del Valle facility. They're spending nearly $15 million on a 3-story building that houses ISO-class cleanrooms and advanced machine shops. The goal here is vertical integration.
Like the Tesla model.
Exactly. Most medical device companies outsource their chip fabrication or their robotic components. Neuralink is doing the opposite. They're microfabricating their thin-film electrode arrays in Fremont, California, but the heavy lifting, the assembly of the N1 Link and the R1 robot, is moving to Texas.
Let's talk about that R1 robot for a second, because that seems to be the real unlock for mass production.
It is. If you want to perform 20,000 surgeries a year, which is their 2031 goal, you can't rely on a handful of elite neurosurgeons doing manual work. It's too slow and too expensive. The R1 is an automated sewing machine that can insert 64 threads into the brain in under 20 minutes.
And each of those threads is thinner than a human hair. But the report mentions a major breakthrough slated for 2026, dura-sparing insertion. Let's break that down for the listeners.
Right. Normally, to get to the brain, you have to remove a piece of the dura. That's the tough, leathery outer membrane protecting the brain. It's a traumatic part of the surgery. Dura-sparing means the robot's needles will be sharp and precise enough to stitch the threads through the dura without removing it.
That's a game changer for recovery times. If you're not cutting out a piece of the brain's protective lining, you're looking at a much less invasive procedure.
Potentially an outpatient procedure. And they've already managed to reduce the cost of producing the surgical needle cartridges by 95%. That is how you get to a mass market price point.
It's interesting, though, because while Neuralink is the one dominating the news, they aren't the only players. I was looking at the competitive landscape in the report. You've got companies like Synchron and BlackRock Neurotech.
It's a crowded field, but the approaches are very different. Synchron uses what they call a stent road. They go in through the blood vessels. It's semi-invasive. They've already implanted about 10 patients. Then you have BlackRock, who have been the industry standard for decades with the Utah array.
But BlackRock's tech is often described as a bit clunky compared to the N1, right?
It's more established, but Neuralink is pushing for higher bandwidth. We're talking about moving from the current channel counts to future generations of the N1 chip that target 3,000 to 25,000 channels.
25,000 channels? The data throughput on that would be insane. What does that actually translate to for a patient?
Well, the current focus is telepathy, giving quadriplegic patients the ability to control a computer cursor or a keyboard with their thoughts. But they're already expanding. They've launched the Blindside Project, which just got FDA Breakthrough Device designation in late 2024. That's aimed at vision restoration.
And then there's Convoy, which is about robotic arm control. It feels like they're moving into a multi-product strategy very quickly.
They are. They've already expanded clinical trials to Canada with CanPrime and the UK with G-Prime. But, and this is a big but, Chloe, the road to mass production isn't just about building factories. It's about biology.
You're talking about gliosis?
Exactly. The brain is a hostile environment for electronics. Over time, the body's immune system responds to the foreign object by forming scar tissue. That's gliosis. If too much scar tissue forms around those threads, the signal degrades. We don't yet have 10 years of data on how these thin film threads hold up in a human brain.
So we have the manufacturing era starting in 2026, but the durability era is still a question mark.
Precisely. And then there are the ethical and regulatory hurdles. To move from these small feasibility studies of 10 or 20 people to a full commercial launch, they have to go through pivotal trials. That involves hundreds of patients and much higher levels of scrutiny from the FDA.
Not to mention the public perception. The report mentions the ongoing debate over animal welfare during their early testing and the eventual move towards cognitive enhancement for healthy people. That's a much harder sell to a regulator than helping a paralyzed person walk or speak.
It is. But if you look at the hiring trends, they're hiring microfabrication specialists, cleanroom engineers, and automation experts. It's clear the company is betting on the Teslification of the brain. They want to turn a complex neurosurgery into a standardized, high-volume industrial process.
It's a bold vision. By 2031, they're aiming for 5 major clinical centers in the U.S. alone, capable of 20,000 surgeries a year. At that scale, we're looking at $1 billion annual revenue stream.
If, and it's a big if, the tech holds up. We've seen the success with Noland and Alex, but mass-producing a medical device that lives inside the human motor cortex is perhaps the most difficult manufacturing challenge on the planet.
It's a lot to take in, from 1,500 electrode systems in lab rats to a 112,000 square foot factory in Texas in less than a decade.
It's the shift from science fiction to industrial reality. No hype, just a very large building and a very complex set of challenges ahead.
Well, that's our deep dive into the manufacturing of the mind. Thanks for joining us.
Join us next time on the DX Today podcast for more facts and no hype. I'm Derek.
And I'm Chloe. We'll see you then.